I can't wait to talk to y'all about some women. So first, I really want to thank everybody here at Occulture, Georgia, everybody here behind the scenes. What a great program, and it's just such an honor to be here with you all today. Just also, what a great group of presenters. So I want to start off this presentation by getting a bit personal with you all about why this topic has gripped me so much of late, why I feel so moved by it. Actually, let me make sure. Oh, yeah, there we are. Why I feel so moved by it and why I feel its urgency. Most frequently, I approach lectures like this one from the perspective of an objective scholar. But just for a moment, I want to talk to you as a practitioner. For so much of my life, magic has been the one thing I return to over and over. It has been the central framework that I have used for empowerment, for finding my place and agency in the universe, and simply for experiencing enchantment. But for a lot of us in this world, the past few years have been pretty harsh, and I can't say that from many vantage points that the future has looked all that rosy. It's often been hard to visualize a future that is any good at all, or even to see sometimes that a future exists. That sort of existential despair is just a hard place from where to live your life, and I would imagine that some of you have experienced something similar from time to time. Suddenly, the fiction of my own personal agency seemed to mean so little against currents that are so vast and overwhelming. And frankly, a lot of the magical paradigms I saw around me felt small and selfish and futile. I started feeling that so many of the problems I was seeing in the world derived from a focus on individual rights, with very little attention paid to our responsibilities, either to each other or to the planet, with everyone operating in their own little sphere of self-interest. I became so aware of the ways in which a lot of modern magical discourses and practices replicated these values, and were sometimes being more immersed in fantasy worlds of the past than addressing the viability of our collective futures. Then I started to notice, bit by bit, the emergence of magics that were less focused on how we as individuals can be better, do more, go faster. People were theorizing magics that foster relationships, creativity, and acknowledge that we are all in this together, every being on this planet. I heard these sentiments in conversations with my magical friends, and also I spotted some similar trends in the research that I was doing, and what I saw felt positive. In recent years, since the publication of my biography of the occultist and surrealist Ithell Colquhoun, I've been writing a lot about art, women, and magic, and I've been asked to put together some surveys of esoterically oriented women artists, past and present. In so doing, a couple of things became clear. First, that women engaging with magic have utterly changed both the worlds and magical cultures and continue to do so. But second, that there's a really exciting new trend out there with women at the forefront that is reshaping what a magical future looks like. And it excited me, and it gave me hope. Contemporary magical practitioners, in which I include pagans and occultists, are often considered somewhat backward-looking in orientation and aesthetic. Western esoteric cultures, including contemporary paganisms and modern occult practitioners, are often characterized what I call romantic anti-modernism, stemming from ideologies of spiritual degradation and loss, and the idea of an imagined golden age, situated in a past free from modern corruptions. In the esoteric cultural milieu, this romanticism often results in a preoccupation with lineages, traditions, and historical connections. Tradition and authenticity are highly regarded in many modern magical cultures, resulting in aesthetics and values which suggest that the past was somehow more connected to authentic magical living, while modernity, and certainly the Enlightenment, and probably Protestantism, degraded the enchanted consciousness of the past. This emerges in a variety of conceits in magical cultures. In paganism, there's a trend toward Reconstructionism, especially among polytheists, which is predicated on the notion that past polytheistic cultures, uncorrupted by Christianity and modernity, somehow had more clear and unmediated gnosis. This sentiment is not limited to Reconstructionists. It is tacitly seen throughout paganism in the tendency to want to base rituals in folkloric materials or to research historically attested practices to help make their practices more authentic. Other forms of modern occultism are also saturated with mythologies of spiritual degradation. Consider tales of Atlantis, thought to have possessed superior spiritual technologies lost to modern humanity, and the esoteric Christian reframings of the initial fall from paradise, to which we can return with the correct ritual techniques and spiritual orientation. Similarly, occult revivals are often couched in terms of a resistance to cold and unfeeling Enlightenment values, imagined secularity, urbanity, and industrial development, all of which ultimately congeal into a looming and pervasive disenchantment. For these reasons, 20th century esoteric philosophies of traditionalism, such as the work of René Guénon and Julius Evola, have certainly been influential in and are even finding new audiences in pagan and occult communities. A recent addition to these anti-modern discourses within the modern occult and pagan milieu is rewilding, drawing on anarcho-primitivism and anti-civilization movements, hoping to get us all back to the garden. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Peter Gray's writing on this, but it's becoming even more of a topic of theoretical influence. There we go. However, even with such a cultural emphasis on tradition and a fetish for the ancient and pre-modern, esoteric practitioners still take an interest in the future. Occult futuristic outlooks aren't even exceptionally historically novel. Scholar Alex Owen, among others, demonstrated the ways in which in the 19th and early 20th centuries, occultists were entangled with emerging scientific discourses and socially progressive politics, as society was still trying to figure out where the limits of science ended and magic began. Fin de siècle and early 20th century occultism was steeped in visions of a spiritually driven and technologically advanced future. This was a period when the occult and art were awash with progressive politics and inspired by the wonders of technology, when the X-ray and photography provided the scientific potential for the eventual proof of numinous dimensions, thoroughly wrapped in occult worldviews about vibrations and electromagnetism. Spiritualism and theosophy were believed to offer experiences that could be subjected to empirical testing, proving that spiritual aspirations could be scientifically supported. So while today, the wildly abstract paintings of Hilma af Klint are appealing partially because of her links with spirits and occult systems of thought, to her, they were just as much indebted to scientific discourses about atoms and the deep patterns underlying the material world. Ithell Colquhoun was an animist who saw spirit running through all things, but she also had a sustained lifelong interest in research about the fourth dimension, which for her explained the existence of spiritual planes that could be reliably accessed through consistent methods. However, most late 19th and early 20th century occultists and esotericists believed that the best future would actually be achieved in returning to an essentialized natural hierarchy to help humanity become the best version of itself. Basically, everything needed to return to its correct place in the universal hierarchy. Russian esoteric futurists, for example, advocated adopting eugenics to help us all become supermen. Some believed that modern science and developments in technology were actually just revealing truths in technology from long ago. A merging of science and spirituality could therefore help us get back on track and beat a retreat from spiritual decay. So esoteric futures of the past were often still linked to idealized histories and narratives of spiritual and technological reclaiming. In fact, the witchcraft tradition of that name, reclaiming, there is still a hint of the mix of progressive politics with the return to a better past. I believe the orientation toward the possibilities of futurist magic genuinely start to shift with chaos magic. In the 70s and 80s, against the backdrop of turbulent British politics, propagating the emergence of punk and working-class creative voices, chaos magicians leveled a somewhat groundbreaking critique of both traditions and hierarchies by adopting a DIY approach to practical magic. Chaos magicians focus on magic as technology, often using the language of quantum physics to explain how chaos magic works. And they also use technology and magic in interesting and novel ways. Lovecraftian entities were just as likely to be sources of divine inspiration as a Greek or Norse god. Although there has been some justifiable critique of chaos magicians as decontextualizing practices and reducing magic into frameworks of utility, chaos magic also encouraged innovation, interesting uses of the internet, and distributed magical networks. Humor and parody and magical mashups were key features of early chaos magic practice, as were, particularly in the US, the influence of the sort of Silicon Valley-inspired techno-utopian visions promoted by publications like Mondo 2000 and emergent trans and posthumanism. It provided an opportunity to start considering what magic might look like when driven by science fiction principles and aesthetics, and where the standards of authenticity of practice could potentially emerge out of experience rather than an authenticated lineage. Although chaos magic is the magic of the future, has not held up as well as it could have, some of its key ideas are resurfacing in a different format, with a separate group of inspirational figures and texts, looking outside of standard occult cultures and frameworks to reshape modern esoteric culture. This emerging crop of science fiction-inspired magicians, many of whom are women, are decentering conventional ideas about what magic looks like, dissolving concepts of Platonic idealism, making way for new connections, new genders, different ways of being, and new parameters for what we call practice. They embrace magic, myth, and otherworldliness, but they also defy and comment upon the ways in which the occult and esoteric have previously been characterized. In fact, these magicians might almost slip the gaze of those who take an interest in esoteric matters, for they hardly replicate the yearning for a romantic, magical past that is often a key feature of the occult aesthetic. Jamie Sutcliffe's edited collection from 2021, Magic, which is a volume in the Whitechapel Documents of Contemporary Art, deftly captures the spirit of this developing occultural sensibility. This collection includes a wide-ranging crop of artists and thinkers from both the past and the present, assembled to provide a new framework for magic and esotericism, intended to guide artistic practice. In this collection, and in its introduction, Sutcliffe critiques a particular view of magic, hemmed in by ideas of tradition and Golden Age thinking, providing a necessary departure from both popular and academic constructions of esotericism. Unlike chaos magicians, these new voices are not unified into a movement, but very much like chaos magic, they are responding to social and political crises. Also, critiquing the state of magical culture, explicitly forming new and creative visions. Also, unlike chaos magic, this trend is not being expressed primarily in occult texts or in new magical orders, although these folks are definitely engaging directly with esoteric subcultures and are building identifiable networks of thought and praxis through art, publishing, and philosophy. Many of these artists and thinkers blend an interest in magic, witchcraft, esotericism, and myth with aesthetics from science fiction, the use of artificial intelligence, and ecofeminism. The writings of Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin merge with queer theory, Afrofuturism, and African futurism, producing theoretical landscapes where indigenous wisdoms fuse with cross-species hybrids, and priestesses, witches, and drones transmit the spores of psychedelic liberation. Donna Haraway dominates the theoretical fabric of all the magical thinkers I am discussing today. Haraway is a feminist historian of science in the History of Consciousness program at the University of Santa Cruz in California, known for her cutting-edge and enduring feminist critiques of culture. You may be familiar with the phrase, "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess," which is attributed to her. Here, her influences range from the Abiding Cyborg Manifesto from 1985 to 2016's ecofeminist Staying with the Trouble, which suggests that all species require each other for survival, and that we should consider how we can all collaborate with one another. One reason that Haraway is so important and so influential is that she moves the conversation about women out of biological essentialism. We are not just our wombs. We can be anything we want to be, including cyborgs and monsters. She's often quite upbeat in her orientation. Her view of the future rests in the idea that at a very basic level, all beings really are atomically connected, and that when we recognize our connections and our common fate, that we may actually be able to care for each other. She emphasizes the planetary condition of various enmeshments with technology, non-human animals, and plants, breaking down conceptual and physical essentialism, promoting an ethos of care and mutuality, what she refers to as the entwinement that emerges from tentacular thinking. Haraway also promotes a conception of creative thinking that she calls feminist speculative fabulation, which has been very influential with the thinkers that I am presenting today. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. Why this is important for the future-oriented magician is that it suggests that we have to have the imagination to create the worlds that we want to see, because the worlds that we are shown as inspiration leave an impact, and they seed the models we live by. If we want a world that is just and fair and loving, we need to start to dream those into existence. So who are some of these people I'm working with, and how do they see magic? I think it's worth explaining at the outset that I will be talking a lot today about artists and their work. For many people, although I'm sure not some of you here, art doesn't look like magic. It seems to sit in a different category. We think of magic enacted primarily in ritual contexts. But what these artists are doing uses art explicitly as magic, as a way of thinking about and enacting change through creating new and different visions of the future, and also challenging us to think differently about the present by shifting our perceptions. Alice Bucknell and her New Mystics project is a, quote, platform for collaboratively exploring the practices of 12 artists, merging magic, mysticism, and ritual with technologies including artificial intelligence, machine learning, and game engines. In characterizing the New Mystics, Bucknell notes the importance of world building and the propensity for these artists to work in multiple genres, using game design, AI, and immersive technologies to provide the ability to create fantastic, dreamlike experiences and virtual collaborative reality. In a way, this project harkens back to the chaos magicians of the 1990s, who used early iterations of the internet in distributed magical workings by creating a shared imaginal space. Here are some pieces from Bucknell's most recent work. The Martian word for world is mother. Bucknell uses game design engines to create immersive worlds, and this project focuses on the very timely topic of the push to colonize Mars. In this story, she presents 3 different futures for Mars: the billionaire renegade, the corporation, and the queer ecofeminist. Bucknell's rich world building helps the viewer to open a conceptual space for theorizing new worlds. In other words, helping us to be able to see and think of things we hadn't previously been able to consider, but with the added urgency of inspiring action. New Mystics artist Zadie Cha, her work often centers on the Korean shaman as grandmother and protector of queer and liminal spaces. She reweaves Korean folk tales with principles of world building to present immersive stories of story and myth that blur the lines of tradition and invention. As we see here, the Korean cosmogonic goddess Mago is reimagined as an orca whale. This is a quote about her work. Influenced by science and speculative fiction writers from Octavia Butler to Audre Lorde, Cha thinks of storytelling as a project of critical distance. Stories can be a means of addressing, expressing, or thinking through broader social, cultural, or environmental challenges too difficult to examine head-on. But that distance can also be a kind of magic, a space of potential that recognizes our interconnected position of precarity and incites a call to action. By weaving together real and imagined worlds, can storytelling become a shared vessel for structural change? We can definitely see the influence of Haraway in the ideas that these magical artists are working toward creating new immersive worlds. The focus on immersion also, interestingly, resonates with some of the earliest aims of ritual occult performance, championed by the 19th century symbolists and later embraced by ritualists such as Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn member and actor Florence Farr, who created theatrical ritual experiences designed not only to produce an altered state of consciousness in the audience, but also to promote personal and social transformation. Bucknell is explicit about the desire of the New Mystics to use the idioms of magic as a vehicle to engage with the legacy of colonialism, racial injustice, and to empower the devoiced. She calls magic an intersectional social process, poised to move beyond the artistic fetishization of symbols and cultural appropriation. Check the time. Taishani works in various genres, including installation, film, and writing, focusing on what Haraway has called speculative feminisms. Her recent project, The Neon Hieroglyph, is a multi-genred work exploring the legendary history of hallucinogenic ergot, the base natural compound of LSD often found on rye bread, about which there are many legendary tales. In this series, time flows effortlessly from the visions of priestesses in the Eleusinian mysteries to an ergot outbreak in a village in mid-century France to a hallucinatory scene from early in the pandemic of 2020. Shani abandons linear time as part of a critique of capitalist and neoliberal narratives of progress. The result is that past and future worlds are conflated. Reality and the mythic exist in a multiverse where everything is possible. As in Bucknell and Cha's work, Shani is interested in generating spaces for imagining new futures unfettered by existing systems of oppression, and for her, altered states of consciousness and psychedelics assist in this. One thing I like about Taishani's work is that witches get to be radical superheroes. For Shani, the witch is an important transgressive figure with the ability to critique and shatter capitalist power structures. In the various artistic iterations of Shani's The Neon Hieroglyph, the witch appears as a dimensional shapeshifter moving through time and space, breaking down oppressive social and cultural structures. In the story of women's esoteric art, the witch is a necessarily ubiquitous figure, speaking to liminality, subjugation, and the suggestion, likely also fear, that women are uniquely placed to walk between the worlds. Historically, we know that witches are outlaws. They curse and heal, which implicates them in the meting out of informal justice as a bit of a vigilante figure. Witches can clearly possess no actual authority, so through magic they can both protect and right wrongs. As such, the cultural positioning of the witch as a motivator of spiritually charged activism is seeing new relevance in an era where formal mechanisms of social care and even the general ethos of social responsibility are disintegrating and failing. Shani's witches are inspired by a remarkable story of the tiny Italian island of Alicudi, where the poverty-stricken residents were said to exist on a diet of ergot-contaminated bread, causing the inhabitants to dwell in a constant visionary state where the limits of reality were uncertain. Out of this hallucinatory world grew tales of the flying women, the Maiara, who would journey to the mainland at night to steal feasts for starving islanders, part of a complex of Italian folk traditions where witches are both the bringer of gifts and also rebels against oppression. In the text of the neon hieroglyph, Shani's witch is a figure of bounty and revolution, performing incantations to the spirits of the matches that will burn the system down. Shani's two sculptural witches produced as part of the material component of the neon hieroglyph are very much not of this plane. Their skin and hair are shades of green, like moss or algae, but shiny and supercharged. They both radiate a certain ecstasy. One witch appears wild with joy, and the other appears serene, hands covered in sores, possibly asleep, possibly dead, wearing the tiniest of all candles on her eyelids, suggesting the power of continual sight. These witches provide a compass toward liberation and in some ways serve as guides through the radical communication of Shani's entire project. Moving on from visual artists. Publisher Sarah Shin's Ignota Books, which has collaborated with both Shani and Bucknell, promotes a list which is deeply connected to the magical and esoteric and is committed to diversity, inclusivity, and creative imaginings of alternative worlds. Ignota is reshaping the magical terrain of both practitioner and audience, inventively blending occultism with indigenous wisdoms, psychedelic culture, eco-mysticism, and artificial intelligence. I think they may be one of the most critically influential new esoteric publishers out there. They recently produced a small edition of Ursula Le Guin's influential feminist essay, The Carrier Bag of Fiction, which is currently inspiring a new generation of readers and is very important to this discussion. The carrier bag of fiction suggests that the original tool was not a sharp stick used to poke, but a sack or container in which we can gather and hold. Le Guin proposes that the stories of the pointy stick, which she calls the killer story, are seen as more interesting and eventful than the stories of the container. But Le Guin argues that containers hold people. Quote, if, however, one avoids the linear, progressive, times-killing arrow motion of the techno-heroic and redefines technology and science as primarily a cultural carrier bag rather than the weapon of domination, one pleasant side effect is that science fiction can be seen as a far less rigid, narrow field, not necessarily Promethean or apocalyptic at all, and in fact, less a mythological genre than a realistic one. Philosopher and chaos magician Patricia McCormick articulates the radical activist potential and inherent queerness of chaos magic, rehabilitating its reputation by identifying it as a potential tactic for a critical undoing of systems of oppression and potentially eliminating anthropocentrism, working toward what she calls an ahuman future. Extinguishing human exceptionalism to live thoughtfully among all beings. In a sense, McCormick is restoring chaos magic back to its revolutionary punk-inspired roots of the 70s and 80s, promoting a DIY culture that is anti-capitalist, creative, and inspired. Aligning and allying itself explicitly with the history of women, minorities, and non-human animals. For McCormick, magic is not about material results, but about ecstasy, intensive encounters with alterity and the other, and the potential of generating imaginative spaces to help us change our perception. She wishes to cultivate immersive environments to experience unbound desire. While her work shares some similar structural critiques and the radical environmental stance of the rewilding movement, McCormick is decidedly future-oriented, promoting an ethos of radical compassion. Whoa. Oh, wait a minute. Do I have? Okay. Sorry. I also wanted to mention Björk because she's cool and because her work frequently intersects with the themes that I'm discussing today. Her biophilia expressed many visions of plant-human hybridity, along with images suggesting the divine feminine in a number of guises and contexts. The video and earthly single Atropos from her new album Phosphora, hope I got that close in pronunciation, takes place in a network of rich, colorful fungi. She explores themes of entanglement and interconnectedness, along with hope, which she calls a muscle that allows us to connect. Perhaps the most critical characteristic of this movement, tying it all together, the one which counters the dominance of Platonic ideals pervading most of the occult, is the rejection of essentialism, the notion that beings are delimited by immutable characteristics. The idea that everything has a singular and unique identifying signature or essence has been crucial to the way that a lot of magic has been conceived. It has, of course, also conditioned our ideas of the divine feminine and divine masculine, shackling us to eternal, unchanging gendered traits. Breaking down and rejecting these Platonic ideals also provides resistance to structures that oppress us, structures that are masquerading as natural, allowing us to create our own hybrid, monstrous, beautiful selves. This new crop of futurist magicians challenge what we mean by nature, asking us to play with it, invert it, by sliding between genders, plants, animals, monsters, aliens, and machines, suggesting that we can be all of these things. These new magics explore creating cross-species relationships through cultivating psychic connections and even shape-shifting. Here is an example from new mystic artist Sia Woolfolk, illustrating her alternative world where women can shapeshift into plants and other beings in order to gain and transmit empathy. Woolfolk's Butler-inspired utopian worlds exemplify Haraway's enmeshment, featuring plant-human hybrid beings of shifting color and gender who gain empathy through experiencing varying realities through their changing bodies. Woolfolk incorporates African and Asian visual influences, yet she wants to show us idealized worlds that are, as she describes them, post-race, post-gender, and also post-human. It is the radical undoing of form, structure, and linearity that lies at the esoteric heart of many of these magical projects, which embrace hybridity, queerness, post-humanism, and an inspirited universe. The power to construct new worlds and new realities is itself deeply magical, suggesting that the agency of transformation is not yet lost. As Alice Bucknell states about the influence of magic in her own work, quote, I think in the simplest of terms, my interest in magic as a kind of technology stems from its ability to break apart or break down certain systems of thinking that have led us into this multi-pronged crisis. It also proposes a speculative and open-ended way out of the mess of the present toward multiple possible futures. In many ways, the revolutionary and collectivist sentiments of this trend are not new. Radical queer witches and liberatory magical politics have always been part of the occult and countercultural landscape. Yet the idea of occultism and futurism of any sort are so frequently placed ideologically at odds with one another that it may be time for a new, radically retooled esoteric futurism to reassert itself. And I'm realizing that what I'm describing does not look like magic to many people. It looks like art or philosophy. However, all these folks are interested in creating or inspiring encounters with the numinous, the imaginal, the inner and outer spaces where we can try to see new ways of being, and also to understand more deeply the connections we already share, and to build new relationships for the purposes of change. I find these perspectives deeply esoteric and certainly mystical. For me, this new crop of magicians presents an opportunity for a distinctively feminist and queer approach to reframing some features of esotericism, and also, importantly, to center women's changing esoteric engagement. It's a way to explore diversity, intersectionality, relationality, and perceptions of the unbounded nature of reality through altered states of consciousness. Importantly, it's also refreshing to identify a magical culture that is actively future-oriented and which takes the collective rather than the individual as the subject and locus of magical activity. In staying with the trouble, we're more likely to survive together. And perhaps it's time for us to start really dreaming of something new and something better. Thank you.